This lecture is going to be about the greenhouse effect and how human sources of greenhouse gases can exacerbate climate change. So before we go into this lecture, I want you to just hit pause and spend a minute or two going over your notes from the climate change lecture. You're going to need to be familiar with those principles as we move forward with this lecture. All right, so first off, how does a greenhouse work? Right? So we talked in the climate change lecture about how radiation, light radiation, comes into the Earth's atmosphere and warms it. So when light radiation essentially hits the Earth, it is transformed into heat radiation. This is the same sort of principle as a greenhouse. So this is why greenhouses can stay warm in the winter. You can grow tomatoes and lilies of the valley and whatever else, whatever other warm weather plants that you want while it's freezing cold outside. So, and this is because the light energy is transformed into heat energy. So our atmosphere provides the same service for us in terms of the outer space is extremely cold, right? I think it's like negative 200 degrees or something. Very, very cold. The only way to heat this little blue and green bubble that we live on is through our atmosphere. So light entering our atmosphere, the scattering that happens, the transfer to heat energy, this is what allows us to continue life in a warm, cozy planet in the middle of the cold desert of outer space. So we talked about how, in our last lecture, we talked about how all organisms are adapted to, or rather I touched on how organisms are adapted to different climates. So I reused our example from a number of weeks ago of polar bears and camels. So if we look at our, let's see how, there we go. So if we look at a fitness graph, we have fitness here. We're going to have a temperature gradient here. And let's say 120 degrees, negative 40, and here we have our polar bear. Yesterday was National Polar Bear Day, if you missed that. And our camel. Now these occupy completely different niches. They have different adaptations to allow them to survive and succeed in their environments that they are adapted to. But if you cause any crossover in environments here, if you transplanted a camel to the environment where a polar bear is, it wouldn't live very long. It doesn't have the adaptations to hold on to heat and to, basically its adaptations are for living in a desert climate, somewhere where it could be losing water, it needs to lose heat, it needs to have behavioral and physiological adaptations that allow it to survive there. So any sort of shifting in this temperature could affect the fitness of these organisms. So as our climate changes and the Earth warms gradually, and you know from our last lecture that the Earth is warming about 1.4 degrees. And this doesn't sound like a lot, again, but when you put this against a wider backdrop of climate and how this influences precipitation, climatic events, this can be a really big problem for some of the organisms that live there. Also, in terms of local variations in climate, this is going to start affecting the fitness of these organisms. So let's suppose that where's my eraser? Here we go. Let's suppose that our Earth warms 5 degrees. And that doesn't seem like a whole lot, but in terms of the temperatures that these organisms are adapted to, this is going to start cutting into their range of adaptation. So instead of having that nice bell shape for polar bears, we're going to start seeing this, where the environment, essentially part of their environment or range of temperatures has disappeared. This temperature is no longer available in their environment, so their environment necessarily shrinks because their environment is dependent on the temperature around them. So this is our polar bears. I guess I actually could have left the other graph up, but we'll just redo this. So this is where our camel was living before. It was fine here, but even camels have an upper limit of what they can take, right? So if we start, oops, this was supposed to be 125. So we'll start seeing a level of habitat, because this is where the temperature is being affected in their habitat. So it's important to note that albedo is influencing polar regions. It's going to influence how well our Earth can reflect light back. So you can think of this in terms of there are stops along the way of climate change, or in this term, in terms of warming temperatures, there are stops along the way on the way to further warming our Earth. So the first stop is emission of solar energy into our atmosphere. And that's important. We don't want to stop that. We don't want to decrease that at all. But once it hits our Earth, then it starts influencing, or rather it starts being influenced by the first thing that we can change, which is albedo. So as albedo is decreased from melting polar ice caps, increasing the surface area of asphalt that we have, or just urbanization, cutting down trees, removing those reflective cuticles from the Earth, essentially, we're going to influence how much light will be reflected back. We're already absorbing more here. Now, once we reflect the light back into the atmosphere, some of these molecules that are there, which are greenhouse gases, I should say not all molecules are greenhouse gases. Not all molecules have the ability to reflect light back to the Earth where it can be absorbed again. Or rather, will reflect light again where it can be absorbed. Greenhouse gases only reflect a certain wavelength of light. This is the energy that will be re-reflected to the Earth and eventually absorbed. And this will increase the warming of our planet. So this is the next step that we influence in terms of climate change and warming, is what the concentration of greenhouse gases are in our atmosphere. So let's talk about those. So greenhouse gases, I think we need a definition here. Let's see. It's not erasing, is it? Oh well. Okay, so greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases, or GHGs. These are molecules, right? They are carbon dioxide, water, other molecules in our atmosphere that reflect this light that allows our Earth to warm and allows us to live in the middle of cold heart of space, essentially. All right, so molecules that reflect the precise wavelength of light to be absorbed and warm the Earth. Warm the Earth's surface. Okay, so again, this is not every molecule. So let's talk about some of the main greenhouse gases. So, well, actually, before that, let's just have a general relationship here for you. So we know that as energy absorbed increases, it's going to outstrip the energy emitted. So that means temperatures are going to rise. So because we know that increasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere will increase the amount of energy that will eventually be absorbed, as greenhouse gases rise, these brackets here, this stands for concentration. So what I'm saying here is as greenhouse gas concentration rises in the atmosphere, the energy absorbed will be greater than the energy emitted. So we know that that's going to cause temperature to rise. So as temperature rises, ice is going to melt. So our polar caps are going to melt. Ice will melt. which decreases albedo. And we know that as albedo decreases, temperatures will rise because it will reflect, it will absorb more light instead of reflecting it. So as greenhouse gases rise, energy absorbed is greater than energy emitted, which will increase the temperature. As the temperature rises, ice will melt, decreases albedo, more light is absorbed, which does what? Increasing temperature. So some key things to, this is a key logic train here that's going to help you understand how global, well, not global warming, but how climate change works in reflection of greenhouse gases. So energy is absorbed, greater than energy emitted, temperature rises, ice will melt, albedo decreases, more light is absorbed, increasing temperature further. And it becomes a vicious cycle after a while. All right, so with that being said, let's look at some of our key greenhouse gases. All right. So, greenhouse gases are added to our atmosphere through natural sources or what's called anthropogenic sources. So what that means, anthro means man or mankind, humans. Genic means beginning, genesis, just how things start. So this means that something starts from people, anthropogenic. And in this case, we're talking about anthropogenic greenhouse gases, which means gases that we're emitting. They're not naturally occurring in these concentrations. We are actually influencing that ourselves. All right, so there's natural sources and natural sinks. So we have our atmosphere, and this is where all of our gases are going to wind up, right? This is what's influencing temperatures. This is what's interacting with our oceans. This is what's interacting with us. So this is our atmospheric reservoir of gases. All right, so we have sources. This is things that put gases, the greenhouse gases, into the atmosphere. And like I said, these can be natural, these can be anthropogenic. But it's important to know the distinction between those. And then we have sinks, which are things that remove greenhouse gases from our atmospheric reservoir. So sinks. And these are also, they can also be anthropogenic or they can be natural, all right? So let's talk about our three most important greenhouse gases. And I'll write them, I think, over here. Well, you can see it better over here, I think, yeah. Okay, so we'll look first at the big one that everyone knows about, carbon dioxide, CO2. Carbon dioxide, all right? Number two that you might not be as familiar with is methane. CH4, that's a methane structure. Methane, bleeding into my thing a little bit here, but that's okay. And then number three, which I'm pretty sure many of you won't have heard about, is nitrous oxide. If you have heard about it, you've probably heard it in context of its social use, which is laughing gas. So it was an early anesthetic. Some dentists actually still use it. It makes you feel no pain, essentially. So that's N2O, nitrous oxide. So let's break down these three different gases. All right, we'll start with CO2. So let's talk about concentrations, okay? So we've talked about the Industrial Revolution before and how that influenced concentrations of gases in our atmosphere. With the rise of industrialization, there's more manufacturing, there's more use of, beginning of a use of fossil fuels and less sustainable ways, essentially, of getting around, of producing, concentrating resources, of producing movement and energy. All right, so our pre-industrial revolution, and I'll do the industrial revolution as IR. So pre-industrial revolution concentration. Remember, these brackets mean concentration here. So this was 280 parts per million. What that means is every million particles in the air, 280 of them are going to be carbon dioxide. All right, so this is natural concentrations before the Industrial Revolution. Now, current concentrations, we just crossed 410 parts per million. So this is a serious increase, a significant increase in the amount of carbon dioxide that's in our atmosphere. But this isn't just carbon dioxide that's just dumped in the atmosphere and it stays there. There are sources and sinks. So let's talk about those. So one of the big sources of carbon dioxide, as we know, we've talked about, you've heard about it before we even got to this class, fossil fuel combustion. Fossil fuel combustion. The burning of those complex hydrocarbons will release carbon dioxide and water through the burning process. So this is one of the big contributors. A second one that you probably aren't as familiar with is actually cement manufacturing. Cement manufacture. Now, about 50% of, about 5%, of all carbon emissions in our atmosphere comes from cement manufacture. Now, of that, about 40% is direct chemical release from the actual chemical process of making cement. It releases quite a bit, an enormous amount of carbon dioxide. The other 60% comes from the energy that's necessary to do this process, to transport the materials, to get the cement in liquid form, you know, those big trucks that turn it over and over. It needs energy to produce cement, to mine the materials that go into it. So that's the breakdown there. It's almost half and half, but this is a significant contributor to atmospheric CO2. A third one is deforestation. And other land use changes. Now, this might not seem like a big deal, but you have forests where large amounts of carbon dioxide are locked up, all right? So this CO2 is sequestered, it's called sequestration, into these plants, where it's essentially inert. It's in organic form, it's used for life, it's not in the atmosphere. But if you take down forests, this wood is going to decay, it's going to degrade. And through that process, we know the process of decay is mediated by microorganisms. These use respiration to break down wood, which releases the carbon dioxide that was sequestered in the wood back into the atmosphere. All right? So the fourth one here is melting permafrost. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the concept, permafrost is essentially in polar regions, it's a section of the Earth, a level of the Earth that does not melt ever. Whatever the temperature never rises enough in the air above the Earth to melt it. And now this permafrost froze a very long time ago when the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was higher. It also has a ton of organic material locked up in it. Dead plants, dead animals, dead microorganisms. As this melts, these come to a normal temperature where microbial degradation can occur. This dumps a bunch of CO2 back into our atmosphere. Now, what are the sinks here? Because there are a few. The first one is plants, forests. We'll say forests because trees in particular hold on to carbon dioxide for a long time, but this is really any plants. The second are our oceans. And luckily for us, our our oceans do pick up a lot of carbon dioxide. Unluckily for us, this is not a trouble-free process. The oceans absorbing carbon dioxide introduces more acidity into the ocean, which causes ocean acidification, which we've talked about in class. All right, so that's our CO2 here. Now, fossil fuel combustion, it's important to note, we know exactly how much of our CO2 footprint comes from fossil fuel combustion. So fossil fuels have a different concentration of carbon isotopes in them. And if you're not familiar, isotopes are essentially every element out there, and we'll use carbon as an example here, has different forms. So carbon is, the reason why carbon is its own element is it has a certain number of protons in the atom's nucleus. That's what makes an element an element. It's counted by the number of protons. Now the number of neutrons that are attached to the nucleus, or part of the nucleus, changes. And these are what make isotopes. So you can have carbon-12, you can have carbon-14, you can have carbon-13. These are different isotopes of carbon. Now, we know that fossil fuel, carbon that's been locked up in fossil fuels, has a different ratio of carbon isotopes than are at normal atmospheric levels. So we can directly track exactly how much of our atmospheric carbon came from fossil fuels. This is really important for our, to know how, essentially how we are influencing our environment in such a strong, significant way. All right, let's talk about our next greenhouse gas, which is methane. So number 2 here, CH4. Now, you might be familiar with methane in terms of, it's usually associated with some kind of smelly process. However, methane itself is actually entirely odorless, but it co-occurs a lot of times with processes that involve sulfur, which gives it that kind of characteristic rotten egg smell. So in terms of digestion, or landfill waste or sewers, it's not actually the methane that is causing the smell, it's the co-occurring sulfur gases. So we're going to talk about our sources and our sinks, but first let's talk about our, oh, where's my red marker? Let's talk about our pre-industrial revolution concentrations, as soon as I find my marker. Here we go. Okay, so think about in terms of our carbon dioxide concentrations, that was about 280 parts per million. So what do you think that CH4, methane, could be in terms of pre-industrial concentration? Give you a second to ponder that. All right, this is going to be, well, not going to be, this was about 722 parts per billion. All right, so billion. Our CO2 concentration was parts per million, but this means that for every billion particles, 722 of them are methane. So much lower concentrations of methane in the atmosphere than there was for carbon dioxide. But as you'll find out in a little while, not all greenhouse gases are created equally. They have different warming potentials, and methane is one of those more strongly, one of the greenhouse gases that has a stronger warming potential. So let's talk about its perturbation. So we know that for CO2, that perturbation has been over 30% already, over a 30% increase. So for pre-industrial revolution to current concentrations, and I actually don't have that off the top of my head, here we go. Okay, current concentrations are right around 1,800 parts per billion. So 1834 to be exact, parts per billion. So this is more than a doubling. While we saw an increase of about 30% for CO2, we're seeing more than 100% increase for our methane concentrations. Now let's talk about some of the sources and sinks here. So this doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are natural and anthropogenic sources. So let's talk about the natural ones first. Number 1 is ruminant livestock. And that is essentially, if you're not familiar with what a ruminant is, it's a cow, it's a goat, it's something that re-chews its cud, essentially, and uses bacteria that allow them to break down cellulose within their stomachs. Humans can't process cellulose. This is why essentially plants have a laxative effect on us because the microorganisms in our guts and we ourselves cannot process that. However, ruminants do have the ability to process that thanks to their co-occurring microorganisms in their guts. So you can see this actually. So we looked at in class today NASA heat maps of how heat in the atmosphere has changed essentially since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But NASA also does maps of concentrations of different greenhouse gases over parts of the world. And these, as you saw from the temperature map, these are not the same across the globe. So in terms of methane, actually there's a giant red blob that exists over Argentina. Argentina its economy relies very heavily on the farming and ranching of cows. So meat export is a huge thing there. And you can see the same sort of thing in parts of North America that have large concentrations of cows or other ruminants. And this is because ranching may not necessarily do this unless you have a sufficient quantity of cows per square foot. So where we do see this effect in terms of concentrations of methane is actually around dairy farms a lot of times, because you've got a ton of cows that are all in a very small space and they don't really move from that area, but they produce a lot of methane just through their normal metabolism, or rather the gut metabolism of their gut microbes. All right, so that's one natural source. Another natural source is, and somewhat anthropogenically mediated, both of these are, because humans use ruminants, and humans also use this next part, which is rice. So rice farming. Now that might seem like kind of a startling or out of place thing, but rice, in case you aren't familiar, is actually a wetlands plant. So it's grown in rice paddies, which are these flooded fields, essentially where rice finds its home and is comfortable growing. Now, existing in wetlands are microorganisms called methanogens. So remember, gen means like genesis, beginning or start, or creator of. So this is creators of methane. As part of their natural metabolism, they create methane. They create methane that is emitted from wetlands, which brings us to our third natural source, which is wetlands. All right, so now we're going to start moving from our natural sources into some of our anthropogenic sources here. So number one is our old friend, fossil fuel combustion. Fossil fuel combustion. And just a quick note here, fossil fuels aren't only petroleum products, all right? This is natural gas, this is coal, this is any old carbon form, essentially, that's non-renewable that we use as a fuel source. So fossil fuels here. Another one is the way that we are affecting the earth in terms of melting. So remember how I said permafrost melting is putting more CO2 into the atmosphere? Well, melting of the permafrost, like I said, there's all kinds of organic materials trapped in there. There's plants and animals and other microorganisms. This is going to activate and, let's see, is going to essentially, decomposition of these organic materials is going to put methane into the atmosphere. And again, this isn't organics in the sense of organic food or organic farming. This is just a carbon-based life form or previous life form if you're looking at the case of dead animals or plants. All right, so this is anaerobic decomposition. So no air is necessary for this to happen. And methane is usually produced as part of an anaerobic process in terms of wetlands, decomposition, ruminants. This is even wetlands, I said wetlands, but rice farming. Those soils underneath the water become anaerobic. They lose the oxygen just through normal metabolism of other microbes there or other organisms. So this is where methanogens come in. They don't need oxygen. They use carbon in order to essentially oxygen sources of energy to power their metabolism. And unfortunately for us, one of their byproducts is methane. Or rather, not unfortunately, because this has been around since the creation of the world. It's just that now, given that we influence the methane cycle as well, it's unfortunate that there's such a large natural production of it. All right, so that's 5. Let's see, what was my last one? Yes, decomposition in landfills. Another source of this actually is decomposition of, let's see, let's adjust that for you. There we go. Decomposition in landfills. Another source of this is actually wastewater treatment plants. So a lot of times at landfills or treatment plants, you'll see this thing. It looks kind of like an old-fashioned train whistle, and it has a flame coming out of it. And this flame changes height and intensity. And basically what's happening is this is a safe release of methane. So not only is it not releasing the methane into the atmosphere to, mess up the balance of greenhouse gases, but it's also, methane is explosive, highly explosive. So they're actually protecting the surrounding environment from spontaneously combusting or exploding, if you're not familiar with that term. There's actually an incident in the Seattle area decades ago where a landfill was buried, and landfill burial is fairly common, but they did not realize that anaerobic decomposition of the landfill would continue underneath the soil. So what happened actually was so much methane built up under the soil that one day it exploded. I'm not sure what the issue was. It might have been construction or something, but all it takes is a stray spark when you have that much methane. And it actually, I don't think anyone was hurt, but it wound up compromising the structural integrity of a lot of homes in the area. So now if you drive past that on your way to SeaTac, you'll see these, basically this kind of open, hilly area with these pipes coming out of it. And what these are methane releasers, and they're also essentially ways for, it's a sampling port so that the public works people can come around and sample how much methane is coming out of the ground, how much explosive gas do we have in the air around us. So it's a good way to regulate that. So it's really important that we burn off that methane before it is essentially blows up. Now, if it safely makes it to the atmosphere without igniting, we have an atmospheric sink here. So there's only really one sink of methane, and that is transformation in the atmosphere. So we'll call it atmospheric transformation. Atmospheric transformation. And how this happens is we have our carbon, or our methane molecule, and we add to it what's called a hydroxyl radical. So this is a molecule of oxygen and hydrogen that has a negative charge on it, and that's what this thing here is. And essentially it is a broken water molecule that's looking for something to dump this extra electron into. It's a very reactive molecule. So when it reacts with methane, what we get here is our old friend CO2 and water. Now this might sound bad, we're creating more CO2, but the greenhouse gas potential of methane is far higher than CO2, so this is actually mitigating the effects of methane in our environment. Now, despite this atmospheric transformation, there's a limited number of hydroxyl radicals that are in the atmosphere, which is why our current atmospheric concentration is still building. Of all the greenhouse gases we're going to look at today, this is the one that has been perturbed the most by humans. So that being said, let's move on to our last greenhouse gas, which is nitrous oxide. And like I said, you may be familiar with this in terms of laughing gas. It was an early anesthetic that was used in the medical community. It was one of the first anesthetics and was, I mean, if you ever watch like old movies about like the Civil War or something, there's always going to be an amputation scene where someone's biting a stick and screaming as they chop his leg off. Luckily, thanks to early pioneering of anesthetics through nitrous oxide, we've been able to get to a point today where they blissfully knock you out while you are being operated on. Much safer, much less stress for the patient. But it's not, medical laughing gas is not the main source of nitrous oxide, right? It's not because someone turned the tap on the gas and let it out into the atmosphere. There are natural sources here. So first off, let's look at our pre-industrial concentration and our current concentration. So, let's see. Our pre-industrial concentration was about 265 parts per billion. So again, parts per billion. This is even lower than for the methane, right? So very small quantities, essentially, in the atmosphere. But it does big things in terms of warming and keeping our Earth warm and not releasing all of that heat energy into outer space. All right, now our current concentration is about 328 parts per billion. So again, doesn't seem like a huge increase, but it's a significant one, and it's here to stay. And the warming potential of nitrous oxide, again, is higher than carbon dioxide. And I'll get to that after I finish discussing this particular gas. So let's talk about sources. What's our number one? We've talked about it in the other two, fossil fuel combustion. All right? Getting tired of writing this. Fossil fuel combustion. Now remember, we don't have carbon to work with in this particular molecule. We're working with nitrogen. So the sources are going to be a little bit different here. Our first source is something we talked about when we went over the nitrogen cycle, is natural denitrification in the soil. So this is a natural source. Probably should have organized that according to anthropogenic and natural, but that's okay. You can sort it out in your notebooks. So, denitrification in soil. All right? So, oh, my computer's shutting off again. I'm going to keep that awake. Hopefully you're not falling asleep as well. Okay, denitrification in the soil, natural process, happens in wetlands, happens in soils, even happens in the oceans to a certain extent. But for now, we're just going to focus on our largest source here, which is soil. Now, another source is a decay of livestock. Let's talk about our agricultural sources here. So first off, before we go to livestock decay, we're going to go to fertilizer. This is the big, oh, that's a 2, I need 3. I need coffee, that's what I need. Fertilizer. Now, you know by now, just from lectures in the past, and even some of the groups in lab that are using nitrogen as your source of fertilizer, nitrogen's a macronutrient. It's necessary for life to occur. It's part of our DNA, it's part of our proteins, it's really, or amino acids that build our proteins. It's really important that we have nitrogen in just to make life happen. So we use fertilizers to boost our production of our availability of nitrogen in the soil to boost our crop production, which, as we know, feeds all the upper trophic levels up to us, who are apex predators. Now the problem with this is that who else lives in the soil? Right here, our denitrifiers. So when we're applying these really nitrogen-rich compounds, it's not all going to the plants. A lot of it is essentially outgassing from the soil, thanks to our denitrifiers, and going back into the atmosphere here. It's a natural byproduct of denitrification. All right, so another agricultural source here is decay of livestock manure. Livestock manure. This doesn't need much explanation. We know that from our previous example with methane, microbial processes are what drive a lot of this cycling in the on the earth, in the atmosphere, just in general. Microbes are what make the world go around and what make nutrients cycle around. So decay of livestock manure through microbial metabolism is going to cause a production of nitrous oxide. All right, now our last bit here is biomass burning. Biomass burning. Okay, what this is a lot of landfills don't bury don't bury the trash, they burn it. All right, now burning has a whole host of issues involved with it. Not only release of carbon dioxide, because that's one of the major products of burning is carbon dioxide and water. Not only the toxicants and pollutants like arsenic and other heavy metals that are released into the atmosphere if you're burning, but also production of nitrous oxide. All right, so this is a really important source of nitrogen, anthropogenic source of nitrous oxide into our atmosphere. Now, let's talk sinks. What could bring this out of the atmosphere? And in fact, this is part of what keeps this concentration from rising faster than it has. So what in this list could possibly related a natural source, perhaps, that's related to a natural sink? So if we just zoom in right here, denitrification of the soil, as we know from our nitrogen cycle, is a natural source. Natural sink would be nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation by bacteria in the soil or in aquatic ecosystems. By bacteria. Right? So luckily these little guys are working overtime for us. They don't just use N2, they also use N2O, depending on what type of nitrogen oxidation or reduction reaction that they're doing. All right, so here's our sources and sinks for nitrous oxide. Now, I've been talking all along how not all greenhouse gases are created equally. Let's finish off our lecture with talking about that. So, we have number one, CO2. Number one in our hearts. Number two is CH4. What is this? Methane. So carbon dioxide, methane. Number three, we have nitrous oxide and 2O. All right? So our top three greenhouse gases that we're talking about here. So greenhouse gas we have here. And we're also going to look at what's called GWP, which is global warming potential. All right? So global warming potential. I write so slowly, I'm sorry. Global warming potential. All right. Now, like I said, they're not all created equally. They have different warming capacities. So what GWP essentially is a measure of, it's a standardized measure of how much heat one of these molecules, a single molecule of one of these gases, will add to the atmosphere relative to one molecule of CO2. So you can think of it as a CO2 heat equivalent, right? So CO2 produces a certain, well, not produces, but rather allows a certain amount of heat to be absorbed by the Earth, a single molecule of CO2. A single molecule of CH4 has the equivalent of blank number of CO2s. So that's how we, just to standardize how greenhouse gases affect our planet, that's the method here, GWPs, global warming potentials. Now let's talk about those. So CO2, because GWPs are based off of CO2, it's going to be a GWP of 1. It's equal to itself. 1 GWP. Actually, we'll do this in red because it's more effective that way. So 1 here. All right, so I talked about how methane has a higher GWP than CO2. So maybe you can just think for a second and guess what that might be, all right, based on its concentrations in the atmosphere. Tip, concentration, pre-industrial concentration at least, can be indicative of how powerful a greenhouse gas is. So the less there is in the atmosphere, the less is needed because it's really strong. So what do you think the GWP of CH4 is? That was a lot of letters there. Okay, hopefully you've thought about that. The GWP here is 12. So 1 methane molecule is worth the heating equivalent of 12 molecules of CO2. Aren't you glad now that the atmospheric sink of methane breaks methane into CO2 molecules? I am, because it only creates one CO2 molecule from a methane molecule, which means we've essentially eliminated the equivalent of 11 carbon dioxide molecules from our atmosphere. That's a big deal, all right? So now let's think about nitrous oxide. This is even lower concentrations in the natural atmosphere than methane. So we could expect this to maybe be higher, right? So what do you think it could be in this case? And then again, another minute just to think about the Jeopardy music while you do this. All right, so our GWP here is 114. So one single molecule of nitrous oxide is worth 114 carbon dioxide molecules. That's a lot, right? So it's really important not just how much carbon dioxide is out there, not just how many molecules, not just essentially how many greenhouse gases there are. We can't think of them as necessarily a big block. There's gradations of their effectiveness in the atmosphere and how they affect, how our influence on producing them is influencing the greater atmosphere through the greenhouse effect. All right? So I'd like you to spend a little bit of time now brainstorming some ways that we can increase sinks for these greenhouse gases and decrease sources. So this can be little things that you do every day, even down to like, maybe I'm gonna eat chicken instead of red meat. It's less of a methane source than a ruminant, right? You could think of something like that, or you could think of something bigger and bolder, like maybe we could talk about making methane processing facilities that would help pull this out of the atmosphere. Maybe we could improve the way that landfills or other waste production or waste processing rather, that produces methane, how that might influence methane and how we could change that. So important things to think about here, right, in terms of all these greenhouse gases. And we're going to discuss this a little bit before we start the activity on Friday. So come with some answers prepared on Friday morning. Don't forget also to bring your laptop. We're going to be doing an activity where you guys are actually going to be looking at climate change data, raw data, and processing it yourself. You're going to be handling data that scientists use in order to prove how global warming is progressing, in order to show how it's affected our planet so far and how it's going to continue to do against the background of global trends. All right, so yeah, come prepared on Friday.